Hello, in this video I want to answer what makes Mao's foreign policy so crazy. There are many things that were crazy about Maoism. A great leap forward that ended up killing 38 million people, the Cultural Revolution that was an attempt to completely wipe out religion and Chinese past and build a new utopian society, but Mao's foreign policy is often overlooked in discussions about Maoism, and that's why I want to make a video that emphasizes how crazy his foreign policy truly was. So here we can see a propaganda poster that glorifies the Sino-Soviet friendship that truly was strong for a while. So the Chinese people did not forget that over 1,000 Soviet pilots died defending their skies against Japan. Nor did they forget that Stalin immensely helped them by giving Manchuria to the communists during the Chinese Civil War. But the Soviets also asked for a lot in return. The Soviets up until 1965 had pretty huge concessions in China, especially in their tungsten mines. And those concessions were too similar to the concessions that the colonial powers previously had in China, which is why Mao Zedong kept these concessions as a secret for a long time. But still, the Sino-Soviet relationship was, on the surface at least, pretty good up until 1959. That is when Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States in an attempt to make peace with the West. Khrushchev was convinced that there is a possibility of peaceful coexistence between capitalism and communism, but Mao Zedong disagreed, and he sought to kind of overpower the Soviet Union and replace them as the #1 country in the communist world, which is why he also seeks to imitate the Soviet space program, and eventually the Chinese even managed to send a satellite into space in 1970. But yeah, Mao Zedong ultimately was pretty crazy, and he wanted to dominate the entire world, or at least he was convinced that the Chinese people, due to their birth rates, are destined to one day control the entire world. And first step in that plan was to dominate the communist bloc. Which is why, after Khrushchev visited the Americans, he started with his propaganda. He wanted to emphasize the Chinese role in anti-colonial struggles all over the world, from Malaysia to many African countries, and he started to describe Soviets as revisionists that appease the colonizers, while the Chinese are the last true communists fighting for freedom of the oppressed people all around the world. And Mao Zedong sincerely hoped that now that Khrushchev is seeking peace with the West, that his more kind of violent and non-appeasing policy would make him a leader of African communists. But that didn't happen. And why is that? I mean, his idea, in theory, even wasn't so crazy. He was the last leader of a big communist country that continued to emphasize that anti-colonialism is more important than peace with the West. But his brilliant idea didn't work, primarily for two reasons. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and it became obvious to the African people that the Soviets aren't appeasing the West. In fact, the entire world got worried that there will be war between the Soviets and the United States. But the main reason for the failure of his policy is the fact that China actually never managed to successfully industrialize during the Great Leap Forward. So during the Great Leap Forward, yes, China did partially industrialize, but Mao Zedong had this brilliant idea that iron and steel should be produced by the people, not by the experts, which is why peasants produced iron and steel in their own backyards, and Mao Zedong ended up with low quality steel. And because of it, Chinese helicopters and tanks weren't really admired by the third world nations that desperately needed weapons in their fight against colonial empires during the 1950s, 1960s, and the first half of the 1970s. The Chinese helicopters had a reputation of just blowing up while they were being used mid-air for no apparent reason. And that is why Mao's plan of kind of replacing the Soviets as the number one failed, and that is why I would argue Mao's China was much less successful than, for example, Stalin's Soviet Union. Stalin did manage to industrialize his country pretty successfully. It was also a violent process, but at least it was successful. Soviet weapons were admired by the people of Angola and Mozambique, and with these weapons the Soviets managed to liberate these two countries in the end. But Chinese weapons, on the other hand, yeah, not so good, as you can see on the screen. And this almost one could say hatred and rivalry that existed between the Soviets and the Chinese culminated in a war that is known as War of the Usura River. So back in the 19th century, the Russian Empire managed to pressure the weak Chinese Empire into giving them more of their land, and the Usura River was then proclaimed to be a border between the two empires. And according to the international law, the middle of the river was always seen as the border, and according to that principle, the Zembao Island was supposed to be Chinese, but still the Russians colonized the island, and the Soviets therefore had the island. And it was during the Cultural Revolution that Mao decided he needs to send a message to his people that his military is still strong and that China will not tolerate humiliation. And he probably did it in order to distract the Chinese people from all the horrors that were happening on their own soil during the Cultural Revolution. And Mao decided enough is enough, we cannot let the Soviets control this small and pointless island, because in theory, and here I would even agree with Mao, in theory it should have been Chinese according to international law. And that is why Mao Zedong ordered for the War of the Usura River to start. And in this pointless clash, 58 Soviets died and 30 Chinese soldiers died as well. But after the clash of the Usura River, the Soviets responded with heavy artillery strikes, and they sent tanks into Xinjiang region of China. And Mao was now scared that the Soviets might either throw nukes on him or that they might retaliate by airstrikes. And now one of the craziest aspects of Maoism began, and that was the Operation Third Front. Mao Zedong mobilized his industry into the hills. Here you can see industry in the hills of Xinjiang. No, in the hills of the Sichuan region, is what I meant to say. So Mao Zedong mobilized millions of people and millions of dollars of equipment into the hills. And yeah, so he also dug out giant caves in order to put industry in them, and he truly was scared that Soviets might destroy his industry from the air or his nuclear reactors, for example. And thousands of people died during this absurd project of moving almost the entirety of the Chinese industry to the hills. And Mao was, at that time, I'm talking about late 1960s, also scared of the Americans potentially destroying the Chinese industry, because Mao was sending a lot of help to the Vietnamese people against the Americans. And so thousands of people died, but once the situation normalized, the communists realized that they just wasted millions millions of dollars for no good reason. They just moved their industry to the hills where it was actually just harder to build stuff, and enormous efforts were wasted, as they often were in Mao's China. But Mao's most bizarre geopolitical adventure was helping the Khmer Rouge movement in Cambodia. Mao Zedong decided to help this extremely primitive and agrarian communist guerrilla fighters led by Pol Pot. And Pol Pot, while he was a communist, he was also an extreme racist and an ultra-nationalist that wanted to create an ethnically pure, great Cambodian empire. So for him, the perfect state was Cambodia in the 12th century, Cambodia of the Middle Ages, and he wanted to create this great Cambodian empire once again. And as you can see on this map, his neighbors didn't appreciate his efforts, and part of his program was killing all the Vietnamese people on his own soil. But he didn't stop there. He also attacked Vietnam and started to genocide Vietnamese on their own soil. And if you take into account that Vietnam was at the time had a population that was 5 times bigger than the population of Cambodia, you should know that that didn't end up good for Pol Pot. Not to mention that Vietnamese economy was way more developed than the Cambodian economy at the time, and this all culminated in the 1978 Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. But Pol Pot, he didn't only kill the Vietnamese people. He was also fanatical about killing the Muslim Cham population. One journalist that visited Cambodia describes seeing hundreds of Muslim heads on spikes near the Mekong River in Cambodia. And Pol Pot wasn't killing the Muslim Cham population just because they were Muslim. He was anti-religious, generally speaking. He was also anti-Buddhist, but he killed the Cham people for 2 reasons, primarily. One, because they were an ethnic minority and he wanted to create an ethnically pure country, as he saw it. And reason number 2 is he believed that the Cham people actually knew black magic. He believed they were wizards. He was killing them for wizardry during the 1970s. There was this ancient Cambodian superstition going back to the 12th century that believed that the Cham people were actually very well versed with magic, especially black magic. And yeah, that's why, according to Pol Pot, the entire Cham population needed to go, and he ended up killing 50% of all the Cham people in his country. And some smaller nations were completely annihilated. For example, the Shani people. They just disappear under Pol Pot's reign of terror. And there is something truly horrible about it every time when a small population and a small culture simply disappear from the face of the earth, as they did in Cambodia. And instead of creating this glorious Cambodian empire, Pol Pot ended up killing 40% of his nation, and he destabilized his country to such an extent that Vietnam ended up conquering his country in a few years. And here we can see the Vietnamese army occupying Cambodia. And since Pol Pot was so crazy, the Vietnamese troops were greeted as liberators even by most Cambodian people. Because Pol Pot, he also caused massive famines, because he killed pretty much all the educated people in his country, and there was nobody to build dams, and then all the dams broke and just flooded the rice fields. And finally the Vietnamese just had enough common sense to bring back schools and universities and start building dams. And also they weren't convinced, as Pol Pot was, that 90% of the people should live in the countryside because civilization allegedly corrupts people and makes them evil. No, the Vietnamese said you can live in the cities as well, and that's why they were so popular. And Mao's brilliant plan of controlling Indochina through Pol Pot actually failed, and he only made his enemy, the Vietnamese people, much stronger, because the Vietnamese ended up controlling not only Cambodia until the 1990s but also Laos, and Mao now lost two of pretty important countries in Indochina. Now they were in the Vietnamese sphere of influence, and Vietnam was a Soviet ally, not a Chinese ally, because the Vietnamese, well, historically speaking, they were scared of Chinese imperialism, which is why there was, and they were right, which is why there was also a war in which at this point it was no longer Mao, but China ended up attacking Vietnam as vengeance for their invasion of Cambodia. But yeah, Vietnam ended up being a Soviet ally, and they famously claimed that Mao Zedong betrayed them, not even by helping Pol Pot, but by making peace with the Americans. And from Mao's perspective, what was tragic is that he wasted somewhere around 5% of his GDP in the early 70s in order to help Vietnam against the Americans, only in order to create a new strong enemy in Indochina that considered his country to be imperialist, and that was Vietnam. And probably the only smart move in foreign policy done by Mao was making peace with the Americans. By making peace with Richard Nixon, Mao Zedong finally gained access to ballistic technology and airplane parts that his economy was so desperately missing, but at the same time he was condemned by many communist countries as a traitor, primarily by Albania, the last European country that still supported Mao, but they no longer supported him after 1972, and by Vietnam, a great communist nation that now had a lot of popularity all around the world for defeating the Americans, but now the Vietnamese were attacking him as an appeaser and an imperialist. So yeah, Mao's great foreign policy wasn't that great after all, and it was just as crazy as his other endeavors, such as the Cultural Revolution and the famous Great Leap Forward.